Y'all, I'm not even trying to be funny when I say that this one is shocking. Hey y'all, I'm Christina and you're listening to History and Hearsay. So I don't typically do the normal YouTube thing where I ask you guys to like and subscribe to my channel, but I was looking at my analytics and like 74% of y'all aren't subscribed. What are you even doing? I'm sure you guys know, but subscribing is free. So if you do subscribe, it's going to send you a notification every time I upload so you guys don't forget about me. Now, you do have to click the little bell, which only 10% of you guys who are subscribed have that clicked. I know my YouTube analytics is giving me all y'all's business. So go ahead, make sure you're subscribed, make sure you have the bell clicked. And if you do, leave me a cookie emoji in the comments. The year is 1904. Michael G. Sheeler, Ohio inmate number 34925, was scheduled to be executed by electric chair just after midnight on June 17, 1904. In preparation, the electrician tested the electrical chair several times that night. Sheeler, who could hear these tests being conducted through the walls as they were happening, became increasingly anxious. I mean, obviously, that just sounds like psychological torture. So Sheeler's pacing anxiously back and forth in his cell, but he's still hanging on to the hope that this isn't going to happen. He has a few things left up his sleeve, and he is certain that a stay of execution is coming. Throughout the night, he's offered a preacher and then a priest to try and comfort him, and he's also offered some whiskey to calm his nerves. But he refuses all of those things, and he doesn't even really eat his supper, which I honestly do feel like would be really hard to eat in that position. I always hear about people on death row who get their last meal, and I do wonder how they can even enjoy that meal. But all throughout this, he was holding out hope that something or someone was going to intervene on his behalf. Something was going to save him from that chair. But as he watched the clock on the wall, the seconds, minutes, and hours ticked by and no one came. Finally, at 11:30 p.m., 2 guards entered his cell and escorted him to the prison barber. Now, part of the process for people being sent to the electric chair included them having their heads shaved. And this was primarily done to ensure that there's good contact with the electrodes that would be placed on the scalp, which of course was believed to allow for a quicker and more reliable execution by preventing hair from interfering with the electrical current flow. So Sheeler is brought into the room. The guard, John O'Brien, who's witnessed more execution than pretty much anyone else at this point, he pulls out a stool for Sheeler to sit on, and he tells him, "Well, Mike, it's time to prepare for this unpleasant ordeal." As he sat down on the stool for his head to be shaved, it finally hit Sheeler that it was over. No one was coming to save him. This was actually going to happen. And this realization caused him to go into a trance-like state. As he made the walk from the barber stool to the hall of death, Sheeler finally resigned himself to his fate as he leaned heavily on guard O'Brien's arm and allowed himself to be led into the death chamber. He was oblivious to the crowd of 35 to 40 people who had gathered to witness his demise. As Deputy Warden Wood gave the approving nod, Sheeler was strapped down to the chair by skilled hands that quickly adjusted the straps. The electrodes were placed on his freshly shaven head and the calf of one leg. The black cap was pulled down over his eyes as the room full of spectators watched silently. You could have heard a pin drop in there. The tension was thick. And then the warden's clear, firm voice rang out in the silence. "Michael Sheeler, have you anything to say before the sentence of the court shall finally have been carried out?" Michael's lips were seen moving, but no sound came out. And I guess this was a one chance to talk kind of thing, because after that, the warden took his watch in his right hand and pulled the lever with his left. Michael's body shot upwards, held back only by the straps that secured him to the chair. Then there was a low hissing sound as 750 volts of electricity shot through the chair and into Michael's body. This went on for 7 seconds before the voltage was reduced to 250 volts for the remainder of the minute. Then they shut the machine off. 6 physicians, including the prison's chief physician, Dr. Thomas, examined Michael's body. They examined the heart, pulse, and eyes. After all 6 were satisfied that he was in fact dead, the guards began to remove the clamps as the warden and spectators all moved to the hallway. But as the guards were moving Sheeler's body to the cooling board, Sheeler let out a sigh. Then a gurgling sound was heard coming from his mouth. As saliva was falling from his mouth, he gasped and started struggling to breathe. The Cincinnati Enquirer would report later that day that he was straightened up in the chair and had begun to breathe heavily, and guttural groans sounded throughout the chamber, chilling the strongest men to the very heart. I cannot even imagine witnessing this. I used to think that being a reporter was a cool job, but I don't know about getting these types of assignments. So Michael is still alive, but he's supposed to be dead. So they call everyone back in there like, oh, just kidding, guys. He's still with us. Let's everybody get back in your seats and try that again. They start setting everything back up. They begin to reassemble all the things. They have to run out and turn the generator back on because it was off. And so to get all of this back up and running takes several minutes, during which Michael Sheeler starts to wake up. The reporter from the Enquirer reported on just how horrific it was to watch all of this unfold. Sheeler seemed to be regaining consciousness at one time. He appeared to throw back his head as if making a desperate effort to talk. The sight was absolutely sickening. Spectators expected to see him recover. So by the time all this done, Michael is fully conscious again. His breathing is fully back to normal and everything. But they still had to get the job done. They crank the machine up to 1750 volts and they try again. This time they left it for 15 seconds before turning it down. And the doctors did an extra careful inspection, examining Michael for 12 whole minutes before deciding that, yep, he's definitely dead this time. All 6 doctors say that beyond a shadow of a doubt, this guy is dead. Okay, we promise it's for real this time. You guys can go ahead and leave. So as the crowd leaves, Michael's body was taken off the chair and he's laid onto the floor. And they're waiting for the undertaker to arrive, which I feel like at this point, this guy is seriously late. Like, where are you? But the warden goes back to his office and all the spectators leave and the 2 guards proceed to cover Michael's body with a sheet. But as they're walking out, they hear a long, painful groan, and once again, Sheeler is making a gurgling sound. Dude, at this point, just be quiet. They think you're dead. So the guard, O'Brien, pulls up the sheet and, crap, this guy's still alive. So there's poor old Michael Sheeler staring right back at him. Sheeler is once again gasping and struggling for air. So they call the warden, you might want to come back in here. So now what? 3rd time's the charm? Now, if you're naturally empathetic like I am, you're probably feeling pretty bad for Michael Sheeler right about now. But you also might be wondering, well, okay, but what did this guy do? Well, I'm glad you asked. Turns out, Michael wasn't a very nice guy. But before we get into exactly what Michael did, settle in for a quick little history lesson. The death penalty has been a part of Ohio's justice system since very early in the state's history. From 1803 to 1885, the death penalty was carried out by way of public hangings. But after a series of botched hangings, people started to wonder if maybe there was a better way to do this. So in 1886, New York State Governor David B. Hill formed the Gary Commission to investigate a more humane means of execution. And during this period of time, there was a dentist by the name of Alfred P. Southwick, and he had attended a lecture where there was a coroner who was discussing their findings of an individual who had been electrocuted and died instantly. Now, hearing this, Southwick was like, idea! This guy is so inspired. He's like, people die when they touch electricity? Gotta find a way to use this. So he starts working with this other man by the name of George E. Fell, and they start conducting experiments, which sounds like they just kind of electrocuted a bunch of animals. I know. So these men just start running the numbers from all of these experiments, and they come up with the calculations for a method that should work on humans. He then decides to use a modified version of the dental chair. I mean, why not? Most people are probably already terrified of that thing anyway. And they develop a way to restrain the condemned person to the chair, inventing the electric chair. In 1897, the electric chair replaced the gallows, and Ohio executed their first ever inmate using the chair. 17-year-old William Haas had been employed and befriended a man by the name of William Brady. One day, when Brady was out of town, Haas had criminally assaulted Brady's wife, slit her throat with a razor blade, set the house on fire, and ran away. So I guess they were kind of like, well, let's start with this guy. They carry out his sentencing by pulsing the electricity 3 times for a total of 2 seconds each time. Everything went according to plan, and the electric chair became the official way that death sentences were carried out. In 1913, the Death House was built in Ohio, which was built specifically to house the electric chair, or Old Sparky, as they called it. And this electric chair was considered to be way, way more advanced than the brutal hangings that had been carried out previously. But as we were discussing in today's episode, there were still several botched executions over the years. Which, of course, brings us back to Micheal. Micheal Sheeler was a saloon keeper in Youngstown, Ohio, which is what they called bartenders back in those days. So Micheal was an immigrant from Hungary, and though he was said to be uneducated and didn't even know how to read, he had still managed to do very well for himself in America and had saved up quite a bit of money. Unfortunately, though, whiskey would be his undoing. Micheal had a reputation for always being in a bad mood, which got even worse when he was drinking. Of course, the last place that a person with a drinking problem needs to be is at a bar, but this was his job. So as you can imagine, this created quite an issue. Now, Micheal had a wife, Mary, and 4 children. And at the time of the story, his daughter, Minnie, was 12, his son, Gustav, was 8, and the baby, Fred, was just 4 years old. But unfortunately, this was not a happy family, as Michael's temper was an issue, and he beat Mary. One time, he beat her so badly that she was barely able to show up to court to testify against him. Their children were terrified of Micheal. They had probably witnessed some of the things that he had done to their mom. While the newspapers don't mention it, we can only assume that he probably wasn't treating his kids too well either. So after that one really bad assault, Micheal was sent to a workhouse as punishment, and Mary got a divorce and obtained full custody of the kids. It's the end of May 1903 when 38-year-old Mary sends $4,000 to her former home in Hungary. Now, this was quite a bit of money. It would have been about $112,000 in today's money. So Mary's plan is that she's setting everything up ahead of time so that she can flee with her children to Hungary. And she has an entire plan on how she's going to educate them once they get over there. Now, it's unclear if Micheal somehow got wind of Mary's plan or if this was just a coincidence. Personally, I think he may have found out that she was trying to flee the country, which I'm going to tell you guys why I think that in a few minutes. But only a few days after Mary has made all of these plans, on June 1st, 1903, Micheal is at work when he decides to give Mary a call. When she answers, he demands that she resume her marital relations with him, saying that if she doesn't, he is going to cut her heart out. Of course, Mary, who is probably used to this type of behavior from him, I mean, she did just divorce him over this exact type of thing, she tells Micheal no, she is not going to get back with him. So Micheal decides that he's going to go over to her house and make her listen to him. So Micheal shows up and he's drunk, of course, and he starts demanding that Mary give him more money. And he's not taking no for an answer. He starts getting more and more aggressive and violent with her, and Mary is terrified. So she yanks out of Micheal's grasp and she makes a run for it. If she can just get out of the house, surely someone will hear her screaming. So Mary is able to make it out of the house and into the backyard, and she's screaming for help. But it didn't matter. Micheal caught up to her and stabbed her in the stomach with a butcher knife. Now, Mary's neighbors did hear her screaming, and they come running out of the house, and they're able to stop the assault. They get the knife away from Micheal, and they held him there until the police arrived. Good for them. That was a pretty brave thing to do. So Mary is rushed to the hospital, and she's able to give the police all the details of exactly what had happened and who had done this to her. Unfortunately, Mary had been disemboweled by the attack, and there was no saving her. And just 5 days later, she passed away from her injuries. So Micheal, of course, was immediately taken into police custody. And during this entire time that Mary is struggling for her life in the hospital, it's noted that he never once asked how his ex-wife was doing. And when police told him that his wife had passed away, he showed zero emotion. After Mary's murder and Michael's arrest, the children were separated. Gustav and Fred went to an orphanage for boys, and Minnie was sent to one for girls. But these poor children were brought to see Micheal in prison. Of course, they didn't want to be there. They didn't want to have anything to do with their mother's killer. Unfortunately, they're not given a choice, so when they get to prison, the children begged their nurse to take them away from him. So once Micheal went to trial, was convicted, and sentenced to death, he had the opportunity to go ahead and put his children up for adoption prior to his execution. But Micheal refused to relinquish his parental rights because he was hoping to use his daughter to plead for his life with the governor. That's right. It turns out the reason Micheal had held out hope that he would get a stay of execution was because he had tried to guilt his 12-year-old daughter into petitioning the governor for him. You just killed her mother and you're asking her to be your advocate? Make it make sense. Micheal had hoped that a plea from his daughter would convince the governor to commute his death sentence to one of life imprisonment. There was a Catholic priest who kept coming to the prison while Micheal was incarcerated, and he was constantly trying to elicit some sort of confession of faith out of Micheal. And Minnie had written to her father, begging him to see this Catholic priest and listen to the things that he was saying. Micheal wanted nothing to do with faith, but perhaps this letter from Minnie, caring for his soul, is what had led him to believe that maybe there was still some love left in her heart for him that he could use to try and manipulate her with. During their second and final meeting before his execution, Micheal Sheeler once again begged his 12-year-old daughter Minnie to call upon the governor in the hope that the governor would find it impossible to turn down a young, sobbing girl. Now, I'm not sure how the reporter gained access to this information, but there was an account in the Cincinnati Enquirer that told all about this final conversation that Micheal had with Minnie. "Go to the governor and save my life, Minnie," Sheeler pleaded. "I cannot go," she answered. "Then write to him, for God's sake, and tell him not to let me be electrocuted." "No, I won't do that," Minnie answered in an emotional voice. "The governor has decided, and I do not want to ask him anyhow." According to the Cincinnati Enquirer, this angered Micheal, and he scolded Minnie. The audacity. A nun who had accompanied the child to Columbus from her orphanage in Cincinnati told a reporter that Minnie feared her father would kill her as he did her mother. Minnie did not want to make the trip, and she had made the nuns promise her that she would not be left alone with her father. This nun actually wanted to go and see the electric chair, and so she told Minnie, "Hey, I'm going to be back in a minute because I want to go see this electric chair." But Minnie would not let the nun leave, and she followed her, saying that she would not stay with her father, even with a prison guard present. Now, one of the most damning pieces of information that was used against Micheal in court, besides the actual victim's statement, was the testimony of a man by the name of Mike Lush, who had testified that he had a conversation in the city prison 2 days after the alleged crime, and while Mary was still alive in the hospital. In this conversation, Micheal had said that if Mrs. Sheeler recovered, he would soon be out of prison and he would kill her again, even if he had to follow her to the old country to do it. So this statement that came out in court is what makes me think Micheal must have found out about Mary's plan to leave the country with the kids, and that's probably why he went to her house in the first place. Now, just in case you need a little further example of the fact that Micheal was a pretty crummy human being, the day before his execution, Micheal met with the attorney that had handled Mary's estate, and he authorized the attorney to liquidate his property holdings in both the United States and Hungary, and then only after some of the money had been used to erect a monument to himself, then and only then did he want the money to go to his 3 children. Build a memorial to your murderous self and then take care of your kids. So now that we all feel just a little less sorry for Micheal, we have to get back to what happened after the 2 failed attempts to carry out Michael's death penalty. They have to try a 3rd time, but this time they decide not to call all the witnesses back in, which I'm going to say was probably a good choice. So the guards, of course, are pretty horrified. I'm sure everyone is just feeling awful at this point. I mean, yeah, he was a pretty rotten guy, but this was starting to cross the line into cruel and unusual punishment. So for this 3rd and hopefully final attempt, the warden and the chief physician go in alone with Micheal. They wanted to make sure that it took this time. They cranked the voltage up to a level that would be completely impossible for anyone to survive. It was so high that it literally burned the top of Micheal Sheeler's head to a crisp, which just sounds awful. Of course, the next day, the newspapers had some pretty harsh words for this whole spectacle, but who was to blame here? When Micheal G. Sheeler was executed, he was the 13th man to be electrocuted by the state of Ohio. The prior 12 electrocutions had gone off well, and there was no reason for prison officials to think that this one would be any different. Now, the other prisoners had a theory. They said it was the fact that Micheal was the 13th man to be executed in that chair. But in order to have an official determination of what had gone wrong, expert electricians were brought in from all over the country to try and determine who had made the mistake that had caused all of this. But every single expert said that everything was perfect. They wouldn't have done anything differently themselves. Ultimately, the determination was made that Michael's refusal to eat or drink for several days prior to his electrocution was to blame for this whole ordeal. Because Michael's body was so depleted of liquid, it had increased his body's resistance to electrocution. Micheal had done this to himself. Now, if you don't already know, you'll probably be happy to know that they stopped using electric chairs in Ohio in 1963, and the use of the electric chair has declined since the advent of lethal injections in 1979, which is now the default method in all U.S. jurisdictions that authorize capital injection. However, in some states, inmates are still able to choose the chair over the injection if they want.